Everybody, welcome to our ABF session for Sunday, April the 5th, Palm Sunday. And we're doing two things today. If you were on Facebook, you must have seen that we were making another technological option available to you called Zoom. In fact, I have two people on Zoom right now. Hi, Carol. Hi, Deb on Zoom. It's good to see you both, and looking forward to you being able to participate in our conversation. If you notice on our Facebook page, for those of you watching the live stream, there is a link you can click on to invite you to the Zoom. So if you want to pop up on my screen over here and have the opportunity to ask questions or give comments during class, if you join the Zoom session, there's a password there. All the information is right on the Facebook page. Just click on the link, and you should be able to go on from there, okay? But we do ask this. If you're watching on Zoom or on Facebook Live through the live stream, only do one or the other. Don't have them both up at the same time, because you'll notice a time lag, and also the audio will kind of mess with each other. So either Zoom or Facebook, but either way, we're really glad to have you here. We've been talking about this idea from Scripture, and I've got the stuff up on the screen behind me. Those of you on Zoom, it may be harder to see. Hopefully the live stream people, it's easier to read. But basically, we've been talking about different ways that storytellers in the Bible indicate to us what it is they want to get across to us, right? And one of the ways that they do this is through what we call type scenes, okay? Type scenes right here, and I give a quick definition of what a type scene is, and I'm going to read it out loud for those of you especially on Zoom, but it's also in your notes. So if you're following along on the notes, there are notes online you can click on and get a PDF so you can kind of follow along with what we're talking about here. Hi, Natalie. How you doing, sweetie? It's good to see you. Okay. So here we go. Here's a type scene. A type scene is a recurring scene that signals an impending significant event. Okay, let me say it again. It's a recurring scene that signals an impending significant event. So the way this works is anytime you've watched a Hallmark movie, right? You watch a Hallmark movie, you know at the first 10 minutes of the movie, number one, the girl is going to have a relationship problem with whoever she's currently dating. That's just inevitable. It's a Hallmark movie. That's just what happens in Hallmark movies. And then, after that happens, she bumps into this other guy who usually annoys her like crazy at first. And you know, 5 minutes into it, that the person she's annoyed with is going to be the person who ends up dating her, right? And then you know that by the end of the movie, there's going to be some great reunion, and they're going to get together, and they're going to fall in love. And then if there's a sequel, it's about them getting married at Graceland or whatever, okay? That's just how Hallmark movies work. And all of them, regardless of the actors, regardless of the stage behind them, all the movies have the same sort of plot lines. They're recurring themes. They're type scenes. In a Western, when two guys are facing off on opposite ends of a deserted street and a tumbleweed goes by, you know what's about to happen. It's a recurring scene that signals an impending significant event. In a Western's case, it's the big shootout. That's how you know the movie's almost over, is there's about to be a duel and a shootout and see who wins the day. The same thing's true in scary movies, right? You know, somebody's alone in a house and they hear a creaking noise from another part of the room. You know something bad is about to happen. And somebody in Star Wars says something like, I've got a bad feeling about this. You know something bad is literally about to happen in the movie. It's just what happens. Well, in Scripture, there's at least 2 or 3 different examples of what they call type scenes, where when you start a story, you like, wait a minute. I've heard this before. This sounds familiar to me. Every time this kind of a thing happens, it seems like something else comes in response to it. So we're going to look at one of those today. And the one we're going to look at today is one we started last week. And I realized the way I kind of organized it was a little bit scattered and disheveled. So today I'm trying to organize it a little bit better so that you guys can follow me a little bit. But the example in Scripture that we're going to talk about today is barrenness. Barrenness. Stories in the Bible about barrenness all sort of happen the same way. And what I'm going to do today is try to prove that to you by looking at actual examples in Scripture of ladies who are barren, families that are barren and can't have kids. And what we'll see is all of these stories follow a similar pattern. Now, what you can surmise, I guess, is that that's just a coincidence, right? That all the stories of barren women in the Bible were, by coincidence, falling in the same pattern. Or you can assume that the storytellers understand that when you start telling a story about a barren woman, it follows this same sort of pattern. Okay? Now, again, I'm not saying that means that it didn't actually happen in history. Some people last week questioned me about that. To say, oh, are you just saying that these stories were like deliberately like rewritten so they would all fit the same pattern, so on and so forth? No, I'm not saying that they changed history to write it this way. I'm just saying they're going to use deliberate cues to make sure you get what they're trying to say by showing that God has worked in these stories in similar ways in the past. Okay? So the template we're going to look at comes out of Genesis. Now, something you need to know about this idea of barrenness. Barren people are only referred to 7 times in the entire Bible. Okay? There's only 7 examples of barrenness in the Scriptures. If you do a quick word search, and I highly recommend you do this, by the way, go on to BibleGateway.com and make that website work for you and save you a ton of time that guys like me, idiots like me, went to college to learn how to do. You go to BibleGateway.com, you type in the word barren, and it'll pop up every occurrence of barren, barrenness in the Bible, and you'll have them all listed right there. And you'll see that there's only 7 different examples. Now, some passages refer to, in a poetic way, a barren woman, but not a specific example of a person. But we have 7 specific examples, and I'm going to try to show you 6 of them today and show you that there's a type or a pattern that works in. Everybody with me? Does that make sense? We good? Okay. So let's look at the first one. And the first one is the one that's the most obvious, and it's the one we talked about. And it's the one that establishes the pattern for the rest of them. And that's the story of Sarai, Abraham and Sarai. Or I should say Abram and Sarai, right? Oh, one more thing I wanted to mention to you. So there's only 7 examples in the entire Bible. Guess how many examples are included in 30 chapters of the Bible? Almost half of them. 3 examples. Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel. Now, let me just ask you a question. Is there any relationship between those 6 characters? They're all related to each other, right? You got Abraham and Sarah. They're the patriarch and matriarch of the whole clan. Then their son Isaac and his wife Rebekah. Then they have 2 kids, right? Jacob and Esau. And then Jacob and his wife Rachel. Rachel is barren. Now his wife Leah is not barren. That's an interesting back and forth in the text that you could look at sometime for fun. Because it's like if you love Maury Povich, or if you love those crazy shows, like I'm trying to think, what was the one of the crazy guy? Oh, come on, you should know this. Was that Jerry Springer? If you like Jerry Springer and you like all the crazy, DNA revelations and all the just insanity that happens there, and people starting to pretend fight and get stopped by the security guys, if you love that, all you got to do is read the book of Genesis, and you'll have plenty of that to satisfy you. So there's all kinds of family drama going on between Jacob and his wives and his kids. Okay, it's super dysfunctional and really very sad. So anyway, so that's what's going on, and I know I had a point. I'm sure there was a point there somewhere. I said Jerry Springer, and then I just went off into La La Land. So anyway, okay, yeah, they're all related, right? So you have grandfather, grandmother, father, mother, and kids. 3 successive generations of barrenness. Now that, I'm sorry, even in the ancient world, barrenness was incredibly rare. And to have it happen in 3 succeeding generations is somewhat surprising, okay? Somewhat unlikely. And so I think it's intentional. I think God did it intentionally to set up a pattern, a template for future stories that he would want to tell about barren women and how God resolves the situation. You with me on that? Okay, so any questions so far? Are we good so far? Does it look okay? All right. So we have three of them that occur in Genesis 12. I'll come back to this passage right here. I know you probably can't see it on Zoom. It's Psalm 113, verse 9. Psalm 113, verse 9, in a very short, compact way, summarizes what I think God is trying to communicate whenever he tells a story about barrenness. But we'll get to that hopefully at the end. Maybe not even till next week, but we'll see. All right, so Psalm 113, 9, we'll get to that next time. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at each story, 6 of them, and it's not going to take as long as you think, so don't worry. 6 of them, we're going to ask 3 questions. Number 1, the first question is, in the story, does the barrenness problem get resolved, right? And usually the answer is probably going to be yes. But then the question is, how does it get resolved? Like, what happens in the story to change what had up until that point been an impossible situation? Then we're going to ask a second question. The second question is, okay, is the character notified ahead of time that the barrenness is going to be resolved? Because we're going to see some similarities and some patterns across all of them that really I think are interesting. And if they're notified, who are they notified by? Or by whom are they notified of that? And then the third question is this. Is the baby that is born, right, the miracle baby, is the miracle baby significant to the larger story of Israel? In other words, are these just sort of anonymous children that are being born to anonymous people in the story, or are they significant people that sort of move the story forward in a significant way? Okay, so that's what we're going to ask. And I'm not going to go passage by passage through the Abraham and Sarah story because it's much more extensive. Like, that's the dominant theme of the entire Abraham narrative, is how is he going to have kids? He's too old. His wife is too old. This is not going to work, right? So that's the dominant theme. So it keeps popping up over and over in the text. So I'm just going to summarize the template for you, and then we're going to look at the other ones, which are much shorter and a little bit more abbreviated, okay? And then you'll be able to participate and help me out. So first, I knew I'd lose it. It's probably in my pocket or something. Okay, so we're talking about Sarah, okay? I'm going to put Sarah over here so you know who we're talking about. Talking about Sarah, okay? So question number 1, does the barrenness get resolved? Does Sarah have a child by the end of the story? Yes, okay. All right. How does it happen? And what I mean by that is, how does, I don't mean it like that. Don't look at me like that. I didn't mean it like that. What I mean is, how does God announce that this is going to happen? All right? In the second story especially, this will be significant. But God basically announces, right? God says, hey, this time next year, you're going to have a child. Remember, that's the occasion when Abraham laughed, or Sarah laughed, and of course she got kind of caught by God for laughing, and she denied that she laughed, and God says, no, I saw you, I know what happened, right? So God announces, hey, this is going to happen. Now, Abraham also asks, okay, Abraham asks God, how are you going to fulfill your promises to me if I don't have any kids? Right? Right now, one of my servants, he says, is my heir because I don't have any kids to pass on all this stuff to. You made promises to me, God. Promises you say you care about. Promises you say you want to do something with. You say you want to make me into a great nation, but you haven't given me any kids, so can I really trust you? Right? That's kind of basically the way the story plays out. And God goes, hold up. I'm going to give you a son. So God promises, and Abraham asks. It's kind of a combination of how the situation gets resolved, okay? Now, is the character Sarah notified she's going to receive a baby before the baby comes? She is, right? I just said it. She is notified. This is really interesting. God and 2 angels go for a stroll one day, right, in the text. They go for a stroll, and they walk by Abraham's tent. Now, we find out the reason God and the 2 angels came down to earth in physical form was, do you remember what it was? Why did they show up in the first place? What was that, Carol? Yes, they're actually going to investigate the claim that Sodom and Gomorrah is wicked and deserves to be destroyed, right? They want to see it apparently with eyes. They want to go down and have boots on the ground to make sure that this thing is actually going to happen, or that it should happen, that they should destroy it or not. And on their way to Sodom and Gomorrah, they stop by Abram's tent, and God himself answers or announces to Sarah, hey, Sarah, I am going to return and I am going to give you a child, okay? So God himself announces the situation. And of course, Sarah struggles with it. She doesn't believe it. She laughs and, my Lord is old and are you serious? And all that stuff. Now, the cool thing is that the baby's born anyway. So even though she struggles a little bit with her faith at first, she puts action to her faith. She has a baby, and she holds this baby in her arms, and it's this beautiful, beautiful scene, wonderful, wonderful scene of joy and happiness. And she calls the child what? Do you remember? What's the child's name? Isaac. Thank you, young man. All right. The child's name is Isaac. All right? And Isaac is an ironic name. It means laughter, right? So she's like, look, when God told me this baby was going to be born, I couldn't believe it, and I laughed in God's face. And so now I'm going to name the boy Laughter so that every time I call his name, hey, Laughter, come in for dinner. Hey, Laughter, go take out the trash. Every time she calls his name, she's going to be playfully reminded of her own lack of faith, and also of the great faithfulness of God to do a miracle even though she didn't have trust in him initially, right? Which, I don't know about you, that kind of gives me hope for my life, because usually my first reaction when God says he's going to do something in my life is yeah, right. Yeah, sure, I'll bet. And it takes me a while to kind of come along, and I think Sarah is a great example of how God is gracious to people like us who have struggles with doubt. It's just, he's cool with that. Not that he wants us to continue in that, but he certainly doesn't crush us for it, and he is actually very accommodating to people who struggle with doubt. Okay? So, this is the way it works. Now, here's a question. Is he significant to the unfolding of the story of Israel? Is he significant? Or is he just sort of like a nameless, anonymous character who disappears from the story? No, he's not, right? He's very significant. Somebody help me out. How is Isaac significant to the rest of the story? What's that, Carol? Okay, because of Isaac, right, we have the descendants continue. Like the line of Abraham, which God had made all these promises to, if it wasn't for Isaac, that line would be broken. And God's promises would come to nothing. So because there's an Isaac, we get a Jacob and Esau. Because we have Jacob and Esau, we get the 12 tribes. And because we have the 12 sons of Jacob, we get all the tribes and all the promises and all the cool stuff that God decided. Do you hear what I'm saying? So is Isaac a significant character in the story? Absolutely. In fact, he's essential to the onworking of the next level of the story. So that's just the summary. And honestly, this is what I'm calling the template. Sarah is the template. She is now, whenever we see a barren story or a story about barrenness in the Old Testament or the New Testament, Sarah is the basic template, the model that we're going to kind of weigh the other stories against. So take out your copy of the scriptures right here, whatever yours look like, and let's go ahead to Genesis 25. Okay, Genesis 25. And we find the second example of a barren person, a barren woman in the scriptures. All right. And we're not doing Sarah anymore. Okay. So Genesis 25, just for audio's sake, I'm going to read it myself. Normally I would make other people read it for me. But Genesis 25, and it's just a couple of verses, verses 19 through 21, has a very quick summary statement of the next example. Verse 19, these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. Verse 21, and Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was what? Unable to conceive, or because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah his wife conceived. Now that's a really quick summary statement. I'm betting Sarah wishes, hey, I wish it had been that easy for me. You know, she had to wait like how many years? And Rebekah, so does the barrenness issue get resolved? The text tells us yes. Now, how does that happen in the sense of who intervenes in the story to make sure that this happens? Somebody in the story intervenes, and because of that, God reverses this barrenness thing. Who is it? Her husband Isaac. And what does Isaac do? Does he like offer a virgin on an altar somewhere, throw her into the volcano? What does he do? He prays to the Lord. Okay? So he prays to the Lord, and that becomes the impetus for this miracle to happen. Okay? Now, another factor to consider in all of this is that the promise to Abraham was for multiple generations of descendants, right? A whole nation would come from him. So if Isaac doesn't have a kid, then God's promise also becomes null and void, right? So Isaac had both, he prayed to Yahweh, and he also had a promise. And the promise was, I will bless you, I'll give you children, I will prosper you. There's two things that lead to the change, just like with Abraham and Sarah. You have the same promise from God, and then in this case, you have Isaac praying to the Lord, saying, God, please reverse this, because your promise is that I'm going to have kids. Rebekah's my wife. I'm not going to repeat my dad's mistake and start marrying slave women. I'm going to stick with one. This is the only one I got. So, Lord, you've got to do something about this situation in order for your promise to come true. And God does an amazing thing. Okay, so in this case, is the character notified ahead of time that this is going to happen? No, not in this case. There's nobody that announces it to her ahead of time, right? She just in fact, they go to God. They go to God and request it. They don't wait for God to come to them and tell them, right? With Abraham and Sarah, they waited for God to come and tell them because they figured it was just all over and done with, right? They just thought it was it's settled or whatever. So since nobody notified, it doesn't matter who because nobody notified her. So here's the question. Is the baby, or in this case babies born, are they significant to the larger story of Israel? Who do we got? We got two boys. Give me their names, please. Yes. The red man. Love that guy. Love him. Jacob and Esau. Two boys. Now, are these boys significant in the unfolding of the rest of the story of Israel? Yeah. So significant, in fact, Jacob actually is Israel, right? That's what his name gets changed to later. He becomes the patriarch that gives birth to the 12 sons that produce the 12 tribes of Israel eventually. In Egypt is where that really, really plays out, okay? So he is incredibly significant to the continuing promises of God being fulfilled. So here we have two barrenness stories back to back, and these two barrenness stories, you see some similarities. The similarities is that you start off with a barren woman, and it's a big problem for God's promises. Because if this barrenness doesn't get resolved, God's promises are not going to come true for Abraham. So God intervenes with Sarah. In Sarah's case, he announces it to her ahead of time. In Rebekah's case, he doesn't, but that's because they take the initiative and they go to God and they pray for a resolution to their crisis. And either way, the children that are born are very significant to the larger story of Israel, okay? So the first two examples, we see a pattern emerging. But we haven't seen enough examples of it yet to really know for sure what's going to happen here. So let's keep going and keep adding examples and see if we can figure out that there's a pattern, a type scene going on here. The third one is Rachel. And Rachel's story begins in Genesis 29, verse 1. Genesis 29, verse 1. All So we go from Rebecca, now we're talking about Rachel. Here we go. So, okay. I gotta summarize. This is too much. Okay, look down to verse 31. Got it? Verse 31 of Genesis 29, verse 31. It says this. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated. Now, context, right? This is where we get into the Jerry Springer land. Jacob wanted to marry Rachel all along. They're the ones that saw each other and had the Hallmark movie moment, right? They had that experience at a well. And you know they're destined to be together. And her dad says, hey, Jacob, tell you what, you work for me for 7 years. I'll let you marry my daughter at the end of the 7 years. And that way, not only will I get a good worker, I'll get a son-in-law out of it. You'll get a beautiful wife out of it and kids. And, you know, Jacob's kind of like coming with nothing. He has nothing in his pocket. So he's like, sure, I'll take whatever deal I can get. I love this woman. I want to marry her. And the text it's kind of a beautiful thing. The text says the 7 years were as nothing to Jacob because of the great love he had for Rachel. So picture every day for 7 years being motivated to impress your father-in-law so that he'll let you marry the woman you want to marry. Some of you maybe can identify with that. I don't know. That happens sometimes. And the wedding happens, and the text literally says he woke up the next morning, and it was Leah, not Rachel. It was the older sister, Leah. And he goes to dad, and he's like, what happened here? And Laban goes, oh, dude, I must not have explained it to you how we do things out here in the desert. If there's a younger sister can't get married before her older sister, so naturally I have to marry off the older sister first. And so you got Leah. Sorry, she has weak eyes. And again, we don't know what that means in the text. It just says she has weak eyes. I don't know what that means. Does she have trouble seeing? I don't know. But either way, Leah is his first wife. She's the one that was given to him first. But he feels cheated, right? Because he felt like, okay, we had a deal in place, and you changed the terms of the deal, which is the way that Jacob's father-in-law operated. Laban was he's a conniver. He's a used car salesman in the worst possible way. And it's funny because Jacob both had some of those tendencies already in him, if you remember how he cheated his brother out of his birthright and all that stuff. But then he really learns how to ramp up the deception and the connivingness throughout the time he's with Laban. Laban kind of shows him the tricks of the trade on how to be, that kind of a cheat kind of a guy. And so Jacob's got cheated. And so he says, okay, here's the deal. I will let you marry Rachel tomorrow if you give me 7 more years of indentured servitude. And I have a feeling Jacob's like, look, I don't want to be stuck with the woman I don't like, and she's just it. I still have a chance to marry this girl that I love. Okay, fine. What's 7 more years? So they have 2 weddings in the space of a week, and now he's got 2 wives. This is a problem, as you probably have pictured. And I think ladies intuitively understand the problems in this story very, 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 very quickly in the narrative. It is not hard to understand why this scenario is not going to work. The next chapter or 2, if you read chapter 29, it turns into, you could call it the baby wars, okay? The baby wars. Leah was the first wife of Jacob. And Leah is having baby after baby after baby after baby. But even though Leah is giving her husband male heirs to the tribe, which is a big deal, Jacob does not like her. He hates her, the text says. He doesn't choose her. He kind of pushes her off to the side in disdain. Why? Because he has a favorite wife, Rachel. And here's the funny thing. Verse 31. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was what? Barren. So the unloved wife, God looks at her pain and goes, you know what? I'm at least going to comfort her with the fact that her husband doesn't love her by allowing her to have children. And Leah is very hopeful, actually, that her bearing children to Jacob will bring about a warmth in his heart towards her. Of course, that never happens, sadly. But Rachel, on the other hand, who gets all the love and the attention and the prominent place and the position, she actually is barren. Okay? So 32. And Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. Verse 33. She conceived again and bore a son and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. Again she conceived and bore a son and said, now this time my husband will be attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore his name was called Levi. And she conceived again and bore a son and said, this time I will praise Yahweh, the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she ceased bearing. 4 sons, rapid succession, boom, 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 boom. 4 heirs to the family. And the sad, sad, sad part of the story is that it seems to have no effect on Jacob. None at all. No effect on his affection towards his first wife, who technically is his real wife, the one that God approves of, obviously, right, because of the way this is playing out. And look at verse 1 of chapter 30. This is when the Jerry Springer stuff really gets underway. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, give me children, or I shall die. Okay, this is not just sibling rivalry. This is like a heart full of pain and disappointment and frustration and jealousy, all mingled up together in a horrible, horrible casserole of bitterness. And she just lets Jacob have it, buddy. He's like, hey, come on. She assumes, I love it. She assumes it's his fault, right? Like, come on, you idiot. Let's, you're supposed to be contributing something here to the problem. Let's fix this. And unfortunately, look at what Jacob says. Jacob gets a little mad at Rachel, which probably was the first time. Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? Now, that's really interesting. Jacob says, it's not my fault, it's what? God's fault. And usually I would look at that and say, come on, buddy, that's just blaming God for something that's not his fault. But we know, because we read earlier in the story, whose fault is it? Is Jacob correct? In this scenario, he's actually right. The Lord had closed the womb of one and opened the womb of another for a reason, to comfort Leah, because Jacob didn't love her. So Rachel is barren because Jacob didn't love Leah, which is strange. But let's come down to verse 22. We'll skip past all the Jerry Springer stuff. If you want to read it, entertain yourself, go crazy. Verse 22 of chapter 30 says this. Then God, what? Remembered Rachel, and God, what did he do? Listened to her and opened her womb. So, what is it that prompts the reversal of the barrenness? What prompted it? Why did God change his mind about Rachel's condition? Rachel prayed. In other words, she stopped blaming her husband and she started to pray to the person who was really responsible for the situation and who could actually fix the situation. She starts praying to God, which is funny because that's exactly what her mother-in-law, who, in her defense, Rachel's never met her. Rachel's never had a conversation with Rebekah. And Jacob probably doesn't know that his parents prayed for him to be born. He probably doesn't even know his mother was barren. I mean, I don't know. Is that the kind of thing you talk about with your kids? Maybe. But I doubt it. So it's not like Rachel knew she had some person she could turn to. But we know because we've seen the last 2 examples of barrenness. We know that if Rachel really wants to change this, number one, it's God's promise. And God's promise is to give children to the children of Abraham. So in that sense, there's the promise there, but there's another factor that's involved, and it's usually intercession or prayer. In Rebekah's case, it's Isaac who prays. In this case, it's Rachel herself who prays. It's not even Jacob. Jacob is not even involved. The thing that's so frustrating to me as I read chapters 29 and 30 and 31 of Genesis is how passive Jacob is in all of this. His wives are bartering for him to see who gets to have the next child. Like they're literally treating him like a hunk of meat. All right? And he's just kind of like, okay. And he just kind of goes around. He's totally passive. He doesn't pray to God. He doesn't ask for God's help. He's just sort of trying to keep everybody happy. That's sort of Jacob's job. And Rachel finally realizes Jacob's not going to solve my problem. And boy, I wish we could figure that out about our significant others. Our significant others are not the people God has put in our lives to solve all of our problems. Now, yes, they have an influence and we need to talk to them about problems and try to fix them together as a team. I get that. But who ultimately is the person we turn to for the fixing of these things that we can't fix? It's the Lord. It's Yahweh. So when you stop putting all of your hope in your spouse and you start to put your hope in the Lord and then work with your spouse to do it, then things start to happen. Okay? So in this case, we have, but again, the pattern is being reinforced, isn't it? You have, the barrenness gets resolved. How? Because Rachel prays. And then there's child. Is the character notified? In this case, no, there's no announcement because, again, Rachel's taking the initiative. She's going to God saying, God, please, please, please give me a child. Okay? And then, is the baby born significant to the story? Who is the baby that is born? What does the text say? Yes, verse 23. She conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. So, the son is born. Who is the next son? It's Joseph. Now, is Joseph significant to the unfolding of the history of Israel? Yes, he is. How is Joseph significant to the next level of the story? If you took Joseph out of the picture and he never was born, what would have happened to Jacob and his family? They would have died out in the famine that hits the whole country, the whole world, right? In fact, Joseph, reflecting upon his life story, which is really an interesting practice, you should probably try it yourself. Joseph, reflecting on his life story at the end of his life with his brothers reunited with him, says to them, God sent me ahead of you to save your lives. Now, is Jesus descended from Joseph? He's actually not. He's descended from one of Leah's boys, whose name you may have heard already that I read. He's the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Judah. Okay? So Judah is actually the son of Leah, the unloved wife. That's who the line of kings comes through, is Judah. We can talk about that some other day. But Joseph is essential to the unfolding of the rest of the story. If Joseph isn't there, Israel doesn't survive. They die off in a famine. They're literally looking at each other with no options except to go to Egypt to buy grain. It's a rough situation they find themselves in. Okay? Next time you go looking for toilet paper at the store and you see the empty shelves, you can sympathize with them, except it's food and grain. And hopefully that won't happen here with all we're going through. I don't think it will. But they certainly were facing with that kind of a desperate situation. Okay? So Joseph is pretty important. Why? He saves his entire family, and he allows the story and the promises of Abraham to continue on for another few generations, right? And then when they're in Egypt, that's when they multiply to become an entire nation. And that's when they head off into the like that. You take Joseph out, like he's the plug in the bottom of the pool, right? You pull Joseph out, all the water leaks out, God's promises come to nothing. So, let's review really quick. And I'm sorry to do this. I hope it's not annoying to you. 3 generations, 3 stories of barrenness, and they all follow a similar pattern. All 3 situations are resolved. All 3 of them have babies that are born. 2 of them, it's because somebody from the family intervened with prayer. God, please, You made us these promises. Please be faithful to your promise and give us a child. And one of them, they were notified by a messenger from outside. And they come to the end, and this child that is born isn't just a child who you love and you hug and, oh, they're wonderful and they look like me and the DNA continues. It's not just that. It's that they are significant to the unfolding of the story of Israel. And that's the template. Now, whenever God or whenever the storytellers, God and the storytellers working together, right? Because this is an inspired text. It's not just humans coming up with stories to entertain us. But later on, whenever the storytellers want to tell a story about a barren woman, they're going to follow this pattern. They're going to follow this type scene. God is going to cause the circumstances to work out so that they mimic the examples from earlier in Genesis. Why? So that when you, the reader, are reading along and you come to a story of barrenness, internally, if you just kind of think about life, you would say, wow, this is going to be a sad story, right? How sad that this couple, this lovely couple, they wanted to have a child, they're unable to have a child, medical doctors can't fix it. Well, I guess we have to just accept it, okay? You're prepared to feel that way. But if you've read Genesis, you're actually primed to think that maybe something different is about to happen. Maybe instead of something difficult or bad happening, maybe something incredibly good is about to happen. So let's take a look and see if it follows the pattern, all right? The next one is, believe it or not, in Judges chapter 13. Judges chapter 13. Judges 13. La-di-da-di-da. Judges 13. If you have chapter titles in your Bible or headings in your Bible, what does the heading say over top of this chapter? Oh, okay. Philistines oppress again. That's definitely true. Does anybody else have a different title? The birth of Samson. Okay? The birth of Samson. So we have, trying to erase all the appropriate places here. Okay, look at verse 1. We've talked about Samson before, if you remember. If you don't, that's fine. I still love you. Judges 13, verse 1 says this. And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord gave them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. That's where you get the oppression of the Philistines again. Verse 2, there was a certain man of Zorah of the tribe of the Danites whose name was Manoah. Manoah. Let's just put his name up here. Manoah. Look at verse 2. His wife was what? Barren and had no children. In case you weren't sure what barren meant, they supply both. Barren and had no children. Verse 3. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, behold, you are barren and have not borne children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Okay, so let's answer a couple of questions here. Oh, and let's just jump down so that you know what happened. Skip down to verse 24. So the end of the story, and we looked at this story like ages ago when we talked about Samson. It's a fascinating, fascinating story. But look at verse 24, just to skip to the end. And the woman bore a son and called his name Samson. And the young man grew, and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in Mahane Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. Okay, so what's the name of the baby that's born? Samson. Samson, okay. Ladies, I'm so sorry. I don't know why this is the case, but Manoah's wife never is named in this story. So the best I can do is say Manoah's wife. It's not because she wasn't important to the story. In fact, if you read the chapter, she is way more spiritually discerning than her idiot husband ever dreamed of being. But for some reason, her name is not recorded for us. But we have Manoah's wife, and we have Samson. So here's the first question, right? Does the barrenness get resolved? Yes, it does. Now, before I jump over to how, let me come to this one. Is the character notified in advance that this is going to happen? Yes. Who announces it to her? An angel of Yahweh. Okay? Is the baby born significant to the larger story of Israel? Yes, right? How is Samson significant to the story of Israel as a nation? Any ideas? What does Samson do? What's that? He's a judge. What do judges do? What is the job description of a judge? Rule over Israel, yes, but usually there's something they have to do before they can rule. Thank you. Anybody who's seen any movie ever, right? You have to kill the bad guys and get rid of the bad guys before you can rule yourself, right? So he is a deliverer and a judge of Israel. Because we read in verse 1 that this story of Manoah and his wife and their son Samson starts by saying that the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and God sent the Midianites to oppress them, okay? So the children of Israel are in big, big trouble. We know this. They're in big, big trouble, and because they're in big, big trouble, they need somebody to deliver them from the Philistines. Now, here's the thing about Samson. Samson does a horrible job of delivering the Israelites from the Philistines. Just horrible. Mediocre. He's a failure. His attention span is worse than a teenager on Mountain Dew. Like, he's just like all over the place, okay? He's just like ADHD. Oh, there's a pretty woman. And his mission to save Israel, I forgot about that now. There's a pretty girl in Gaza. I got to go check her out. There's a pretty girl over here I got to check. And that's how he gets himself into trouble. Now, the text does tell us that Samson begins the process of delivering Israel from the Philistines. But who eventually becomes the final victor over the Philistines? Finally, once and for all, answering the threat of the Philistines. And that's a tricky question, isn't it? It's a young man by the name of David. David becomes the solution to the problem of Samson. Samson started the job. David finishes the job. Is David significant to the story of Israel? He becomes the beginning of the kingship and the Davidic line through whom the Messiah would come. So Samson prepares the way for the Messiah, well, not the Messiah, but for the king who will eventually be the one through whom the Messiah will come, right? Samson. So he is significant. He's not quite as significant as Jacob maybe, or Joseph, or Isaac, but he is important in the playing out of the story. And what I will say is this: if Samson hadn't have squandered his life, he would have been a much more significant player in this story. Which is a warning to all of us. That God's plans will be accomplished whether you get on board or not. But if you choose to not get on board, God might just accomplish all of his promises, and you might get either a back seat, or you might be grabbing onto the back end of the car on the outside, going along on a skateboard behind, or you might get left in the dust in the back. So the idea is, yes, God is sovereign and is going to do what he's going to do. But if you don't jump on board and engage in the mission he's called you to, you might just miss out on the blessing. You might just watch God do it through somebody else. And the reward and the opportunity for blessing might pass you by. That's Saul. It's another thing about Saul's life too. Make sense? So anyway, Samson prepares the way for David, who finishes the job with the Philistines. Now, remember that. Remember that. Okay, next one. Number 5. Okay, we have a new character. Turn to 1 Samuel chapter 1. 1 Samuel chapter 1. And we come to one of the truly noble and awesome examples for women, especially in the Old Testament. Like, if you aspire to be a woman of character and integrity, you ought to have Hannah as one of your heroes. She is legitimately, without any besmirching of her character, is a hero in the text. 1 Samuel chapter 1, and I want you to notice some correlations to previous stories, okay? And I want you to see this pattern that emerges. All right, I'm going to get there. Hang in there. 1 Samuel chapter 1. There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim. I'm telling you, the reason you guys pay me the big bucks is to pronounce those kinds of names. Ramathaim Zophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah the son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of all those guys. Verse 2. He had how many wives? That's really interesting. Who does that remind you of? Jacob and Leah. Leah and Rachel. You should think of that immediately, because there's not a lot of examples of a guy who has two wives. But let's get into more detail. Verse 2. He had two wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other was Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had, wait a minute, two wives, one with kids, one without. Ring any bells, right? Verse 3. Now this man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the two sons of Eli were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he gave a double portion, because he what? Loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb or given her no children. Now, does that sound like the Jacob, Leah, and Rachel story? It's like exactly the same. The wife who has no kids is the loved one, and the one who has the many kids is not as loved, or maybe unloved in the case of Leah. Verse 6, and her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. Does that sound like anything else? Like, this is like almost word for word, pattern for pattern, a repeat of the Jacob, Leah, and Rachel love triangle, Jerry Springer edition, right? Like, this is happening all over again. And so when you read this, if your mind doesn't run back to the lessons of Jacob, Leah, and Rachel, then you're missing the point. The writer doesn't want you to pretend like this is a brand new story. He's using a type scene to remind you that this is going to turn out okay. It turned out okay for Jacob, Leah, and Rachel. It's going to turn out okay for Hannah. And then we find out the story, right? You remember the story? I'm not going to read the whole thing because I want to get through the next one as well. Hannah is just bitter in her spirit. She's hurting. And one day she decides to go to the tabernacle. You remember this? She goes to the tabernacle. And what does she do? Now, hold on a second. When Rachel finally figured out that Jacob couldn't solve her problem, what did she do? She prayed. And the Lord listened to her. The Lord remembered her. And she got a son, right? So what happens here? Hannah, maybe herself having learned from Rachel's story, decides to not bother her husband with this, because in the end it's not his fault and it's not anything he can change or fix on his own. And she goes to the tabernacle and she starts praying, and her heart is so heavy that she's mouthing the words and no sound is coming out, right? Well, she's misunderstood by the priest, Eli, who seems to be a bit of a blockhead anyway. And Eli says to her, "Put away your drink, woman." He thinks she's there blabbering in some kind of a drunken stupor, instead of realizing that the agony she's in is over the fact that she has no child. And so she is praying to God, and then the priest, when he hears her story, says, "Oh, my bad." And then he basically says, "May the Lord grant you your request." And then 9 months later, guess what happens? A baby is born. And who is this baby? Samuel. Samuel. Is Samuel significant to the unfolding of the story? If you read 1 Samuel, you will realize there is a crisis in leadership amongst God's people. The judges are horrible. The priests are horrible. The priests are breaking commandments left and right. They're doing their thing in the temple or in the tabernacle and then going off and cheating people and extorting people and other things with people that there's probably kids listening and I don't want to talk about. They are completely depraved and horrible leaders. And then God gives Samuel to Hannah. And from the time he's a little boy, 3 or 4, Noah's age, he's dropped off at the tabernacle. And he's raised in the tabernacle. And he becomes a faithful priest and judge of God's people. Eli and his sons pass off the scene. Samuel takes over. And it's Samuel's spiritual leadership that discovers a very important character in the rest of the story. Who is that important character? Who anointed a little shepherd boy from Bethlehem? Samuel. He finds this ruddy-faced kid named David. And the rest, as they say, right, is history. So how important is Samuel? He's super important to the unfolding of the story. But we knew that. As soon as we found out that this woman was barren, we knew this was going to happen. It's like a Hallmark movie. As soon as they meet each other in the cafe, he knocks over her coffee and she's like, "What's wrong with you?" And he's like, "You watch yourself." Like, you know they're going to end up together. You just know. Well, this is the 5th barrenness story in the Old Testament. We know how this is going to play out. It's going to be a combination of some kind of announcement or some kind of a thing, and eventually it's going to turn into a story of hope. Not a story of despair and sadness and, oh, life is horrible. It's a story of hope. So then when we come to Luke chapter 1, and there's these 2 old people that have no kids named Zachariah and Elizabeth, what do you know is going to happen? You know God is going to undo the barrenness and that the child that is born is going to be significant to the unfolding of the story. Not only that, they get an angel, right, who comes to Zechariah and says, "Hey, you're going to have a kid." And so you have all these echoes of the Abraham and Sarah story. You also have echoes from the Manoah's wife story as well, because she gets an announcement from an angel that this is going to happen. And who is born as a result of this miracle that happens? Who's born? John the Baptist. And how important is John the Baptist in the unfolding of the story of God? He becomes the forerunner for the Messiah. Just like Samson was the forerunner of David, starting a problem that David finishes with the Philistines, John the Baptist is going to begin the process of turning the people back to God that Jesus is going to finish with his life, ministry, death, and resurrection. All of these echoes, all of these barrenness stories are borrowing from each other so that we, as we're reading, go, I know this is going to turn out well. I know this baby is going to have a great life. I know this baby is going to be significant to the continuation of the story of God. That's what barrenness stories in the Bible are about. They're about how God takes impossible situations, unfixable by humanity, and he can bring hope, and he can bring life, and he can bring just joy out of the entire process. And it's just an amazing thing. So here's the final question, and we'll wrap this up with some summary statements next week. But I don't want you to miss this before I leave you. I've got like 2 minutes. So, when an angel shows up to a teenage girl in Nazareth, and he says, "You're going to give birth to the Messiah." And she goes, "Sir, I'm not married. I don't have a husband. How's that going to work exactly?" What are we already prepared to believe? That this impossible situation is going to work out. Why? Because in Genesis 3 times it happened. Then again it happens in Judges. And then it happens in 1 Samuel. And then it happened like 3 months ago with her elderly cousin named Elizabeth. God does the impossible in the middle of impossible situations when his honor is on the line and his promises must be kept. And God had promised Israel, I'm going to send you a Messiah. And he brought that Messiah in the most unlikely way possible. But if you're paying attention to the rest of the story, as soon as the angel Gabriel shows up at her house and says, Mary, this is going to happen, you need to know that that is the way it's going to work. Type scenes. Love you. See you next week. Bye-bye. Probably got cut off on the end of the live screen.